This is the story of how I caught my parents plotting behind my back and took back my life on my own terms. My name is Claire Monroe. I'm 31 years old, and I never thought I'd be the kind of person who'd cut off her own family. I used to think people who walked away from their parents were bitter or broken. But now I know sometimes it's the only way to survive. It started on a Tuesday afternoon in late May. I was standing in my kitchen in Portland, Oregon, stirring a pot of lentil soup, half listening to a podcast about restoring old farmhouses when my phone buzzed. It was my dad calling from Spain. My parents, Michael and Linda Monroe, had been traveling across Europe for the past 5 weeks. It was a dream trip they'd always talked about and one I'd mostly paid for. I picked up with a smile, expecting a quick check-in or maybe a question about how the garden was doing while they were away. "Hey, Dad, everything okay?" His voice sounded rushed. "Claire, where did you put the warranty for the water heater? Your mom says it's acting up again." I walked into the office and rummaged through the filing cabinet. "Bottom drawer folder marked Utilities," I said, "behind the insurance papers." There was a muffled "got it" and then nothing. I assumed he'd hung up. But a few seconds later the line stayed open and I heard him talking. Not to me. To my mom. "She's just a burden, Linda," he said casually, like he was commenting on the weather. "Always with her hand out. Always needing something." I froze. "She thinks we're actually going to let her keep that house," he added, almost laughing. "After everything we've done for her, we let her stay there out of generosity. The house. The one my grandmother left me. Paid off. In my name. The one I'd been maintaining and paying property taxes on for the last 6 years. The house I thought was mine. But to them, it was leverage. It was a tool. It was something they believed they still controlled. I should have hung up. I should have thrown the phone across the room. But I couldn't move. I stood there, spoon still in my hand, listening. My mom's voice joined in, laced with sarcasm. "She'll cave, Michael. She always caves. Just make her feel guilty. Remind her we're her parents. That's all it takes. She'll sign it over eventually." There was a long pause, then more laughter. "Maybe we start talking about needing in-home care," she added. "Nursing bills, doctor appointments. That'll guilt her into it. She won't abandon us." That word again, burden. I'd always tried to do the right thing. I'd covered bills when they were short. I let them move in temporarily when Dad lost his job. I cooked, cleaned, fixed leaky sinks, juggled my job, and caretaking without a single complaint. I thought I was being a good daughter. But in their eyes, I was never enough. They were halfway around the world spending my money, plotting how to steal from me and calling me a burden while doing it. I finally ended the call. My hands were shaking so hard I almost dropped the phone. My soup had burned. My heart was racing. I walked into the backyard barefoot, dazed, and sat down on the deck trying to understand what I had just heard. I wanted to believe I misunderstood. That maybe they were joking. That maybe they were stressed or venting. But I knew better. This wasn't new. It had been like this for years, just more subtle. Guilt trips, gaslighting, little comments about how I owed them everything. But this time, it was loud and clear. They were coming for my house. They thought they could manipulate me into giving it to them. And worse, they didn't love me for who I was. They only valued what I could give them. That night I didn't sleep. I lay in bed replaying the conversation over and over, hearing the cruel certainty in my dad's voice, the smug calculation in my mom's. And something inside me snapped, not in anger, but in clarity. If I was such a burden to them, maybe it was time to relieve them of me. Maybe it was time to disappear. Growing up, my house never felt like home. We lived in a cramped 2-bedroom rental in northern Idaho where the carpet was always stained and the walls were thin enough to hear every argument through. My parents, Michael and Linda Monroe, worked hard. I'll give them that. Dad did long shifts at the lumberyard, and Mom bounced between cleaning jobs and cashier work at a local grocery store. But effort and affection aren't the same thing. They gave everything to their work and left little for me. I was an only child, but I never felt special. Every backpack, every field trip, every dentist appointment came with a sigh, a lecture, or a snide comment like, "This is why we can't have nice things." Money was tight, yes, but love felt even tighter. I learned early not to ask for much. When I needed new shoes, I'd try to hide the holes until someone at school noticed. When my winter coat didn't fit anymore, I layered up in sweatshirts. They said I was too sensitive when I cried, that I needed to be grateful, that they sacrificed too much for me already. But then there was Grandma Irene. She lived alone in a quiet corner of Spokane in a little Victorian house that always smelled like cinnamon and garden soil. She had wild gray curls and wore long, soft scarves that trailed behind her when she walked. And when I was with her, I felt like I could exhale. Grandma never made me feel like a burden. She didn't count what she gave. She'd scoop me up in her arms and whisper, "You don't have to earn love, Claire. You just have to accept it." We'd spend weekends in her kitchen baking cookies or in her garden where she taught me how to prune roses and find worms after the rain. She had this way of listening, not just hearing, but listening. As if my little thoughts mattered in the grand scheme of things. I'd sit on the front steps of her house, chin in my hands, dreaming of living there someday. A place with creaky floors, overgrown vines, and peace. A place that felt mine. She'd laugh and say, "Well, who knows, sweetheart? Maybe someday you will." And that someday came sooner than I expected. Grandma passed away during my final year of college. It was sudden, a stroke in her sleep. I was shattered. My parents were more focused on what her estate might include than mourning her. I remember sitting in the lawyer's office surrounded by legal documents and tissue boxes when he read the will. I leave my home at 318 Waverly Avenue and all its contents to my granddaughter Claire Monroe, who has shown more heart kindness and strength than most adults twice her age. I didn't cry then. I didn't smile either. I just sat there stunned. My parents did cry furious tears. They received a modest life insurance payout which they promptly used to lease a new car and book a trip to Cancun. No one asked how I was doing. No one helped me clean out Grandma's house. I moved in that spring and took a job at a local publishing company. The house was old but solid. I fixed what I could, painted the walls soft blue, and kept her hydrangeas alive in the garden. For the first time, I had something stable. Something mine. But when my parents showed up a year later, suitcases in hand and eviction notice in their eyes, things started to change. They'd lost their rental due to unpaid rent and said they needed a place to get back on their feet. I said yes because I still wanted to be a good daughter, but it didn't feel like an invitation. It felt like an intrusion. Suddenly, my things were in boxes in the garage. My mom redecorated the living room for better feng shui. My dad installed his old recliner in front of the fireplace and claimed the master bedroom. It was like I had handed them the keys not just to the door but to my life. And somehow I believed I had no right to say no. I paid the mortgage. I paid the bills. I drove them to doctor appointments and job interviews they never showed up for. I cooked every meal, and I told myself it was temporary. That they would appreciate me. That they would leave when things got better. But things never got better. Only heavier. And now, after that phone call, I finally understood why. They never saw me as a daughter. I was an asset, a backup plan, a retirement fund, and I was done. I didn't have the luxury of time to wallow in heartbreak, not when clarity had finally found me. The morning after that devastating phone call, I sat at the small oak table in my kitchen, staring at my untouched coffee as the sun filtered in through the lace curtains Grandma had once hung herself. My mind raced. Their voices still echoed in my ears. "She'll sign it over eventually. She's just a burden." I grabbed a legal pad and started writing not a letter, not a goodbye, but a plan. Step 1. Find out exactly what legal rights they had. I wasn't naive enough to assume ownership would shield me if they were cunning. I'd allowed them to live in the house for nearly 4 years. They had mail sent here, helped paint a wall or two. I'd heard stories of people losing homes over lesser arrangements. I reached out to a real estate attorney I'd worked with at the publishing firm. Her name was Meredith Lang, a sharp and discreet woman with a talent for cutting through emotional fog with brutal legal clarity. I didn't sugarcoat anything. "I own the house free and clear," I said, voice trembling. "But my parents have been living here rent-free. They're plotting to take it from me." She listened quietly, nodding occasionally over the phone, and then said the words I needed most. "They don't have a legal leg to stand on, Claire. You've paid the property taxes, utilities, maintenance. You never co-titled the deed. They're guests, nothing more." That gave me the first breath of relief I'd taken in days. But I knew this wasn't going to be about law. It would be about emotion, about guilt. They were masters at guilt. Step 2, get them out. But I couldn't just throw them on the street, even if they deserved it. I didn't want that kind of drama, that kind of stain. And honestly, some part of me still felt obligated to protect them even after everything. I called a moving company and asked for a quote on separating and packing belongings into 2 distinct categories, mine and theirs. The receptionist asked if I was going through a divorce. Something like that, I said, my voice low. I opened a private storage unit in their names, paid 6 months in advance, and ensured everything they'd left behind would be safe and documented. I took photos, videos, even made a spreadsheet detailing which items were theirs. Step 3, sell the house. That was the hardest pill to swallow. This house wasn't just a house. It was my sanctuary. My link to Grandma. The creaky wood floors and clawfoot bathtub held memories no one else could understand. But now, it had become a battlefield. As long as that house existed in its current form, my parents would never stop trying to control it or me. I called Samuel Ortiz, a private realtor I trusted from college. "I need to sell," I told him. Quietly, quickly, and with as little visibility as possible. "You sure?" he asked gently. "That house meant something to you." "It used to," I replied. "Now it means escape." We scheduled private showings only. No signs, no listings on big platforms. I didn't want word getting around before I was ready. Step 4, disappear. I opened new bank accounts, created a new email address, changed my phone number. I even looked into therapy for the first time in my life, something Grandma had always gently encouraged. But I'd shrugged off. And most importantly, I started searching for a new place to live. Not just a roof and 4 walls, but a home without ghosts. As I packed up my things, I found a small jewelry box tucked inside the back of Grandma's armoire. Inside was a folded note yellowing with age. "If you're reading this, then something in your heart has been broken. I'm sorry, but I want you to remember, just because someone shares your blood doesn't mean they share your soul. You deserve a peaceful life, Claire. One built on love, not obligation. Don't let them make you forget that." I broke down sobbing. She had known. Somehow she had known. That night, I sat alone on the floor of the empty guest room, surrounded by boxes, holding that note to my chest. The silence in the house was louder than ever. But for the first time, it didn't feel suffocating. It felt like resolve. 2 weeks. That's how long it took to sell the house. Samuel moved fast, too fast, honestly. He had a list of pre-qualified buyers who were hungry for off-market properties in our part of Portland. Within days, a software engineer relocating from Seattle toured the place, and the offer came in at $972,000, close enough to market value that I barely blinked. I signed the contract, scheduled closing, and set the final moving date. And then, I waited. I thought I'd feel triumphant, maybe even vindicated, but instead I felt hollow. The days blurred together. I packed in silence, labeling boxes by room, then by memory. Kitchen, Grandma's blue teapot. Living room, Mom's vase she never asked permission to bring. I was methodical, detached, efficient. I avoided the family photos for as long as I could, but eventually I came across one that made my breath catch. It was from my 10th birthday, a backyard party at Grandma's. I was sitting on Dad's shoulders, laughing with my arms stretched toward the sky, ice cream smeared across my face. My mom stood behind us, smiling faintly, holding a wrapped present. I stared at that picture for a long time. The girl in the photo had no idea. No idea what kind of emotional debt her parents would eventually demand payment for. No idea that love in her household would always come with terms and fine print. I put the photo in the parents' items box without another glance. The final week moved fast. Movers arrived promptly at 8 a.m. on a Wednesday, just 3 days before my parents were scheduled to return from Europe. My belongings went into a truck bound for a small furnished rental on the edge of the city, temporary quiet mine. Their items went into another truck bound for the climate-controlled storage unit I had opened in their name. I left instructions prepaid 6 months and made sure the access code was mailed to their hotel in Lisbon. By noon, the house was empty. It didn't feel like revenge. It felt like surgery, necessary, painful, and sterile. I walked through each room one last time. Ran my hand along the chipped banister I used to sit on as a kid. Stood in the kitchen where Grandma taught me to make lemon bars. Pulled open the back door to see the garden still blooming with peonies she planted more than a decade ago. It wasn't my house anymore, but it would always be her love that built it. I left a note on the granite counter. Just a single line in black ink written on a crisp white envelope. Surprise, a burden did this, and I meant every word. I locked the front door, slipped the keys into an envelope for the new owner, and walked down the front steps without looking back. I expected guilt to follow me, but instead, it was silence. Not heavy silence, the oppressive kind I'd grown up with, but light, breathable. Like I could finally hear myself think again. That night in my temporary apartment, I curled up on the unfamiliar beige couch with a microwave dinner and a bottle of cheap wine. I looked around at the blank walls, the standard issue furniture, the view of the strip mall parking lot from the window. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't permanent. But it was mine. And more than anything, it was peaceful. I didn't check my old voicemail. I didn't open my email. I just sat in that quiet, finally alone, with no one expecting me to explain, justify, or give up something in return for love. That peace didn't last long, of course. I knew what was coming. I knew the storm that would hit the moment my parents landed and saw the locks changed, the empty house, the note. But for that one night, I slept better than I had in years. Because the war was over, and I had finally chosen me. They landed on a Sunday. I knew this not because they told me, but because my old phone, which I still checked once a day out of morbid curiosity, exploded with notifications. Missed calls, voicemails, texts that started calm, then spiraled into full-blown fury. Voicemail Mevher 11:03 a.m. Claire, what the hell is going on? We just got home and our key doesn't work. Call us right now. Voicemail Nur 2, 11:47 a.m. Claire Monroe. This is not funny. Where are you? Why is the house empty? Voicemail Nur 3, 12:26 p.m. Sweetheart, we're very worried about you. Please call us. We just want to make sure you're safe. The sweetheart part almost made me laugh, almost. They cycled through the phases like clockwork: confusion, denial, manipulation, and then full-blown threats. Text from my dad, 2:12 p.m. We found your note. You think you're clever. This is our home. You had no right to sell it. We're contacting a lawyer. Email from my mother, 4:56 p.m. Claire, I don't know what you think you heard, but you've made a huge mistake. This isn't how families solve problems. Call us. And then the real bomb dropped the next morning. My coworker Jamie texted me, your parents showed up here. Loud. Boss had to call security. I closed my laptop and sat in stunned silence at the kitchen island of my rental, a spoon halfway to my mouth. They'd actually come to my workplace. Caused a scene. Over a house they didn't even own. My phone rang less than an hour later. It was my manager, Lori. Claire, she said calmly, they made some pretty serious accusations. They said you sold their home illegally. I closed my eyes and inhaled. It wasn't their home, Lori. It was mine. Fully in my name. They were staying there as guests. They left for Europe, and I sold the house while they were gone. There was a long pause. I could hear her processing. And they're saying you did this behind their backs. I did, I replied. Because I overheard them on a call they didn't realize was still live talking about manipulating me into signing over the deed. I heard her shift in her chair, then exhale. Well, she said they've been banned from the premises. You don't need to worry about them showing up here again. I choked on the lump in my throat. Thank you. Take the week? More if you need it. And if there's anything I can do? I didn't expect the kindness. I didn't realize how tightly I'd been holding my breath until that moment. I thought I'd be fired, or at least judged. But instead, I was protected, respected. That night, I lit a candle on the windowsill of my temporary apartment and let the flame dance while I watched the messages pour in. They emailed again. They texted. They even called people I hadn't spoken to in years, former neighbors, extended family coworkers, my college roommate, each time trying to fish out where I was, what I was doing, how they could get to me. And still, no apology. Just accusations, blame, demands, until finally an email came in that nearly made me spit out my tea from laughing. We're willing to forgive you. It said if you use the money from the house to buy a new home for all of us, a fresh start, forgive me. They still thought they had the power, that their forgiveness was something I needed, that after all this I'd fold, that I'd buy us a house and go right back to being their doormat. I didn't reply. Instead, I forwarded the email to Meredith, my attorney, who responded with exactly what I needed. They have no claim. You acted within your legal rights. Stay silent. Stay distant. I nodded to myself. The door was closed. Legally, emotionally, physically. But what I didn't know then was that the final confrontation hadn't even happened yet. 3 weeks passed. For the first time in years, my life felt quiet. Not just the absence of noise kind of quiet, but the kind that comes when you're no longer under surveillance. I went for morning walks, ate whatever I wanted, watched TV shows without commentary or questions. It was like breathing after being underwater for far too long. But the tension hadn't vanished. It had simply moved underground, waiting. And then came the call I wasn't ready for. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Rachel Chin, my old neighbor from Waverly Avenue, called. I hadn't heard from her in over a year. We'd exchanged cookies at Christmas, shared a few late-night garden chats, but she'd mostly kept her distance from my family drama. So when I saw her name light up my new phone screen, my stomach clenched. "Claire," she said, "I thought you should know. Your parents are back at the house." I blinked. "What do you mean, back at the house? It's not their house anymore." "I know," Rachel said carefully, "but they're parked in the driveway, just sitting there. The new owners are out of town this week, so I don't think they've noticed." I went silent. 1,000 images ran through my head. Them standing on the porch trying to use the key that no longer worked. Pressing their faces to the glass. Maybe even breaking in. "I just thought you'd want to know," she said again. I swallowed hard. "Yeah, thank you." The moment we hung up, I called Richard Thompson, the new owner. Calmly, professionally, I explained the situation. He was surprisingly understanding. "Appreciate the heads up," he said. "I'll have our security company do a drive-by tonight." But that wasn't the end. Later that evening, my phone rang again, this time from a number I didn't recognize. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Claire." It was my father. Just that, my name. No greeting. Just the clipped, sharp tone I hadn't heard in weeks. "We need to talk. Tomorrow. The coffee shop on Maple Street. 10 a.m. I stayed silent. "If you don't show," he continued, "we're going to your office again. And this time, we won't leave quietly." He hung up. My fingers gripped the edge of the kitchen counter. I wanted to scream, to cry, to call my lawyer, call the cops, call anyone who could just make this stop. Instead, I took a breath and called Meredith. "They're threatening to come to my workplace," I told her. "If I don't meet them." "You have grounds for a restraining order," she said instantly. "I can file the paperwork today." I hesitated. "No, I think I need to face them. Just once, but on my terms." There was silence on the line. Then don't go alone. Make it public. Make it safe, I agreed. The next morning, I arrived at the daily grind at 10:15 a.m., late enough to remind them I wasn't obeying anymore, but not late enough to seem fearful. I chose this place deliberately. It was always crowded. The owner was a friend of a friend. The baristas knew me. There were eyes everywhere. I spotted them instantly. They were seated in the far corner, my mother in a stiff wool coat despite the warm spring air, my father in that same faded leather jacket he wore every Thanksgiving. Their postures were rigid, faces hard. They looked tired, angry, determined. I walked straight to them, chin high, and said clearly, "Robert." "Linda." My mother flinched. My father scowled. "Sit down." "I'm not here to take orders," I said, voice level. "If you want to talk, it happens on equal ground. Or not at all." I sat and placed my phone, already recording, on the table between us. My mother's eyes widened. "Is that really necessary?" "Yes," I replied. "Given our history, I record all important business conversations now." My father laughed coldly. "We're your parents, not business associates. Then you shouldn't have threatened to disrupt my workplace if I didn't comply." They went silent. I leaned forward slightly. "What do you want?" He looked at me, eyes narrowing. "What you did was unforgivable. You sold our home. You left us homeless." "It was never your home," I said. "It was mine. A gift from Grandma. Fully in my name. You lived there as guests, and you made it clear in your own words that you planned to take it from me." My mother's face paled. I pressed play. Their voices filled the space between us. "She's just a burden. She'll cave. We just need to guilt her." My mom whispered, "You recorded us." I looked her in the eye. "You didn't hang up. I was on the call. That recording is legal." My father clenched his fists. "You manipulated everything." "No," I said, voice steady. "I finally stopped letting you manipulate me." My mother's lips trembled, but the tears I expected didn't fall. She reached for her coffee cup, suddenly very interested in the foam on top, as if she could hide behind it. My father, on the other hand, leaned in. His voice dropped to that low, dangerous whisper I remembered from childhood, the one that meant I was about to be grounded for speaking up, for disrespecting him, for simply having my own thoughts. "You think you're so much better than us now, don't you?" he hissed. "With your fancy job, your new little apartment, and your therapist who tells you what a victim you are." I didn't flinch. "I think," I said calmly, "that I'm finally becoming someone who refuses to be used." He slammed his palm on the table, drawing stares from the people nearby. "We raised you. We gave you everything. You wouldn't even have that house if it weren't for us." "That house wasn't yours to give," I said, my voice rising just enough to match his intensity. "Grandma left it to me because she saw something in me that, frankly, I don't think either of you ever did." My mom finally spoke. Her voice was thin, almost desperate. "Claire, sweetie, we never meant to hurt you. We were stressed, tired. We were just talking. People say things they don't mean." "Then why did you never apologize?" I asked. "Not once. Not for the things you said, not for showing up at my job, not for threatening to sue me. You never even acknowledged the betrayal." She blinked rapidly. "We didn't think you'd take it this far. We thought you'd come to your senses." I shook my head. Coming to my senses is exactly what I did. For a moment, no one said anything. The tension at our small corner table was a storm cloud, thick and ready to burst. And then, for the first time, my mother's voice cracked, not with tears, but with bitterness. "So what now?" she asked. "You're cutting us off forever, after all we did for you." I leaned forward, feeling the weight of years settle into the space between us. "After everything you did to me, yes. Unless something changes, unless you truly own what you've done, and not just out of obligation, I don't see how we move forward." My father scoffed. "So you're just going to throw us away?" "I'm not throwing anyone away," I said. "I'm choosing myself. For once." They both sat in stunned silence. And maybe for the first time in my life, I didn't feel smaller in their presence. I didn't feel like I owed them anything. I stood up slowly and reached into my bag, pulling out a plain envelope. This has the information for the storage unit, I said, placing it on the table. 6 months prepaid. Your things are safe. After that, it's your responsibility. My father looked away. My mother stared at the envelope like it might bite her. I hope you find peace, I said softly. But I won't be your punching bag anymore, and I won't be your property. I turned to leave, and just before I stepped out the door, I heard my mother call after me. Claire, she said, her voice cracking for real this time. We did love you. We just didn't know how to show it. I paused but didn't turn back. I know, I said, and that's the saddest part. I walked out into the bright mid-morning sun. My heart was pounding, but I didn't feel broken. I felt whole. Outside the cafe, the breeze caught the edge of my blazer. I tugged it tighter, walked to my car, and slid into the driver's seat. For a moment, I sat there letting it all wash over me. The confrontation was done. The lines were drawn. And I had chosen a future without manipulation, without guilt, without conditions. They might never understand. But for once, that wasn't my burden to carry. I didn't cry after the confrontation. Not in the car. Not that night. Not even when I took a long hot shower and stared at myself in the mirror, wondering if that conversation had just severed the final thread tethering me to the only family I'd ever known. Instead, I felt something else. Something sharper but steadier. I felt clean. There's a strange kind of peace that comes from standing your ground. Like rinsing off years of old expectations, obligations, and guilt you didn't even realize were clinging to your skin. But healing isn't linear. 2 days later, I found myself spiraling again. Sitting on the couch in my rental, surrounded by unopened mail and half-eaten takeout, I stared blankly at a documentary playing on the TV. I couldn't tell you what it was about. My brain was busy replaying that final moment in the cafe over and over again. We did love you. We just didn't know how to show it. That sentence haunted me not because I believed it, but because a part of me wanted to. That's what being raised on conditional love does to you. It teaches you to accept crumbs and call it a feast, to find meaning in manipulation, to justify cruelty with excuses like, they had a hard life, or they didn't know any better. I needed help sorting through the noise in my head. For the first time in my life, I reached out to a therapist. Her name was Dr. Naomi Wells. She was warm, soft-spoken, and straightforward in a way that didn't feel judgmental. I told her everything in our first session about the inheritance, the years of manipulation, the phone call that changed everything, and the final showdown at the coffee shop. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, I looked up at her eyes glassy and asked quietly, was I too harsh? She leaned forward slightly. Claire, what you experienced was a textbook case of financial abuse. I blinked. Wait, what? Financial abuse, she repeated gently. It's a form of control using money or access to assets to manipulate someone's behavior. It's incredibly common in families, but rarely talked about. Your parents made you feel guilty for having something that was rightfully yours. They depended on you financially while undermining your autonomy. That's abuse. Hearing those words out loud made something inside me loosen, not break, but release. I had spent years blaming myself for being too emotional, too reactive, too difficult, for somehow failing as a daughter. But now I had language for what had happened, and language is power. Dr. Wells encouraged me to keep a journal. Write everything down, she said, especially when the guilt creeps in. And when you hear their voices in your head, write yours louder. So I did. Every morning with my coffee, I sat on the tiny balcony of my rental and wrote. Some days it was angry, other days it was sad. But every page was a brick in the foundation of a new boundary, one they could no longer cross. A week later, while sorting through the last of my grandmother's boxes, I came across something I hadn't seen before. A sealed envelope with my name written on the front in her neat cursive. Inside was a short letter written only a few months before she passed. Claire, if you're reading this, it means I'm not there to remind you that your worth isn't up for debate. You've always had a light in you that your parents couldn't see, not because it wasn't there, but because they were too busy chasing their own shadows. Don't let them dim you. The house is yours. But more importantly, so is your future. Build something beautiful. I sat on the floor and sobbed. Not because I was broken, but because I was finally healing. Grandma had seen me. Really seen me. And in that moment, even though she was gone, I didn't feel alone. The very next morning, I picked up the phone and called Dr. Wells again. I want to do something with this, I told her. I want to help others like me. She smiled. Then let's start building. The idea started small, just a flicker. Maybe it was the combination of therapy and finally being able to breathe. Or maybe it was Grandma's letter still ringing in my ears. But something inside me whispered, "You're not the only one." I kept thinking about all the people out there, especially women, who'd been manipulated out of money, out of homes, out of their own self-worth, all under the warm, toxic disguise of family. I had spent years being made to feel like everything I had was borrowed, like I had to earn every kindness, like my own success should come with a portion cut out for others who never lifted me up. So I decided to do something about it. At my next therapy session, I told Dr. Wells I want to start a workshop. A real one. For first-time homeowners. Especially those who've been manipulated or pressured by family. She didn't flinch. She smiled. I think that's a brilliant idea. I talked to my boss at the firm, Vanessa Sharp Practical, always 5 steps ahead. When I pitched the idea, I thought she might laugh, or at least brush it off as some side project I'd lose interest in. But she didn't. This is exactly the kind of value we should be offering, she said. Financial literacy isn't just about numbers. It's about freedom. She gave me 2 months of development time and access to our media team. I called the program Building Foundations Financial Autonomy in Major Life Decisions. The title was long. The mission was clear. We built the workshop around real stories, some mine, some submitted anonymously, case studies, red flags, emotional pressure tactics, what to look out for when co-signing anything, how to set boundaries in financial conversations, and most importantly, how to recognize when someone is using love as leverage. When we hosted the first Saturday session, I expected maybe 12 people. 37 showed up. Some came alone. Others brought friends or partners. A few brought notebooks and took pages of notes. But what floored me was the tears. Not during the budgeting segment, not during the property tax breakdown, but when we talked about family expectations. A woman in her 50s told us about how her son guilted her into signing her house over to him, then evicted her when he got married. A young man shared how his parents opened credit cards in his name when he was 14, wrecking his credit before he even had a chance. A woman my age raised her hand and said, voice trembling, "My dad says I owe him a down payment because he raised me. I don't know how to say no without feeling like a bad daughter." I sat down beside her and said, "You're not a bad daughter for protecting yourself. You're a whole person. You deserve safety even from the people who gave you life." The room went quiet. Then applause. Not for me, but for her, for saying it out loud. For naming it. We did 3 more sessions that month. Word spread. Local women's shelters and credit counseling services started referring people to us. A regional women's magazine called Northwest Voices interviewed me for a feature. The title read, "From Burden to Builder, Claire Monroe's Mission to End Financial Manipulation." I cried when I saw it, not out of pride but out of release. It was like the younger version of me, the girl who sat on the floor of her childhood bedroom wondering if she'd ever be enough, was finally being told, "You are, and you always were." And then something happened that I didn't expect. I got a message on LinkedIn from Judith Fletcher, my grandmother's younger sister. I hadn't seen her since Grandma's funeral. She wrote, "Claire, I just read the article. You have no idea how proud Elizabeth would be. She saw the same thing in you that I do now. Courage, integrity. The kind of backbone our family hasn't seen in generations." I stared at that message for a long time. Then I wrote back, "Thank you. I'm finally beginning to understand why she left the house to me. Not just to give me a home, but to give me a chance to build something better. She responded simply, "And you are. Keep going." That night, I sat outside on the balcony of my rental tee in hand moon overhead. I wasn't where I wanted to be yet, but I wasn't where I used to be either. And for once, that was enough. 1 year. That's how long it had been since I sold the house. Since I slipped the note onto the granite counter and walked away from the only place that had ever felt remotely like home. I marked the anniversary not with fanfare, but with flowers, pink peonies, Grandma's favorite. I drove to her cemetery just outside Spokane, a quiet little plot under the shadow of old cedar trees, and sat beside her headstone with the bouquet resting in my lap. I didn't speak at first. There was so much to say, but also nothing to explain. I wasn't here to justify or apologize. I was here because she had seen me when no one else had, and somehow even in death she had given me a map out of the darkness. "I think I finally understand," I said softly. "Why you left it all to me. Why you never told them. Why you made it so clear." The wind rustled through the grass, warm and gentle. It almost felt like a nod. "I used to think the house was your gift," I continued. "But now I see, it wasn't just a house. It was a doorway, a boundary, a chance to choose myself, even when it hurt." I sat with her for a long time. When I finally stood to leave, I tucked the flowers gently into the holder beside the stone and whispered, "Thank you for loving me without conditions. I'm trying to pass that forward." As I drove back to Portland, I felt lighter than I had in months. The road unfurled before me like an open promise. Back at my apartment, I curled up on the couch with a glass of wine and opened an old photo album I hadn't dared touch in years. It was full of birthdays, holidays, and summer vacations. Smiling faces, forced poses, pictures taken just before or just after some quiet, emotional storm. For the first time, I looked at those photos without guilt or grief. They were chapters in a book I had finished. I didn't need to rip out the pages. I just didn't need to reread them anymore. Instead, I began building a new story, one where I wasn't defined by what I owed, but by what I chose. One where family meant trust, not manipulation. Where love didn't come with contracts. Where boundaries weren't betrayal, they were protection. Professionally, I was thriving. The workshop had expanded into a recurring series, and my firm had embraced it as a cornerstone of their mission to support financial literacy. I had become a go-to for clients navigating complex emotional family transactions, divorces, inheritances, property battles. I knew what they were feeling because I'd lived it. And personally, I was rebuilding slowly but meaningfully. I had reconnected with a few old friends, people I'd let drift away because my parents didn't approve of them. I joined a hiking group on weekends, started volunteering at a local community center teaching women how to read contracts and protect their financial futures. One night after a long workshop session, I got a text from one of our regular attendees, a single mom named Alicia. I didn't sign the loan. I told him I needed more time and legal review. "Thank you for giving me the tools to say no." I sat in my car and cried for a full 5 minutes. Not because I was sad, but because someone somewhere had just avoided the kind of trap I'd lived through for years. That was the real inheritance Grandma had left me, not the house. But the strength to break the cycle. I don't know if my parents ever really understood what they lost. After our coffee shop confrontation, they tried to reach out a few more times, mostly veiled guilt trips wrapped in fake concern. I didn't respond. Eventually, the messages stopped. I haven't seen them since. Do I miss them sometimes? Do I love them in a distant, complicated way? But do I trust them? No. And that's okay. Because sometimes love without safety isn't love, it's obligation. And I finally understand the difference. A few months after the 1-year anniversary of the house sale, something unexpected happened. I was standing in the conference room after a workshop stacking chairs and collecting stray coffee cups when Vanessa, my boss, walked in with a thoughtful look on her face. "You've got a visitor," she said, arching an eyebrow. "Older woman. Said she's your aunt." My heart skipped. I hadn't spoken to anyone in my extended family in over a year, not since the fallout. My mom's siblings had stayed mostly neutral and my dad's side silent. Which was fine. Preferred even. But then I remembered. Aunt Judith, I asked cautiously. Vanessa nodded. She's waiting in reception. I wiped my hands on my jeans and headed toward the lobby, unsure what I'd find. And there she was, Judith Fletcher, my grandmother's younger sister. Petite, silver-haired, wearing a floral blouse and an anxious smile. "Claire?" she breathed when she saw me, arms opening for a tentative hug. I let her pull me in. She smelled faintly of lavender and peppermint. The scent of someone who still wrote letters by hand. "I saw the article about your workshop," she said once we sat down in the break room with 2 paper cups of tea. I knew I had to reach out. I wasn't sure anyone on that side of the family wanted anything to do with me, I admitted. Her expression softened. "Oh, honey, your parents created that distance, not you." Elizabeth, your grandmother, wasn't surprised by how things turned out. She always worried Robert wouldn't grow up. He always expected things to be handed to him. I sat back stunned. She never told me that. She didn't want to poison your heart against him. But she knew. And she was proud of you, Claire. Leaving you that house wasn't just a gift, it was a vote of confidence. She believed you'd do something meaningful with it. I looked down at my cup. I hope I have. Judith reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope. She wrote this the month before she passed. I just found it in an old drawer. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. Inside was another letter written in that same elegant script I remembered from birthday cards and recipe notes. "Judith, if anything happens to me, please make sure Claire knows I chose her on purpose. Not out of obligation, but out of love. I've seen her strength, her kindness, her fire. She'll need that fire to survive what's coming. The others, they'll try to take from her. But she won't let them. She's not the weak one. She's the one who changes everything." My eyes stung. I had spent so long wondering if I'd overreacted, if selling the house was too extreme, if cutting off my parents made me cruel. But Grandma had known. She had trusted me. And now Judith did too. We talked for over an hour. She told me stories about my grandmother's early years, about how she built her real estate portfolio from nothing after her husband died, about how she used to joke that being underestimated was her superpower. "She would have loved what you're doing," Judith said, as we hugged goodbye. "You're carrying on her legacy in the best way." As I watched her walk down the hallway, something clicked. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was healing. And I wasn't alone. Later that week, I found myself rereading both of Grandma's letters, the one I'd found in the jewelry box and the one Judith had just delivered. Side by side, they felt like a blueprint, a guide for what to do next. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need validation. What I needed was to keep building. Not just workshops, but something bigger. A space for people like me, like that woman in my seminar who cried when she said no for the first time, like the man who discovered his parents drained his savings account, like every person who had ever been told they owed their family their future. I opened a fresh notebook, drew a line across the top, and wrote 5 simple words. Burden no more the foundation. It would be a non-profit, a hub, a resource center for victims of financial manipulation and abuse. Legal help, emotional support, real estate literacy, community, a place where no one would ever be made to feel small again for protecting what was rightfully theirs. I didn't know how to fund it. I didn't know how big it would grow, but I knew what it would stand for, and I knew who it was for. Grandma, me, and everyone who'd ever been told they didn't deserve what they'd earned. We did, and we always had. Launching Burden No More was the boldest thing I'd ever done and the scariest. At first, it was just me, a borrowed co-working desk, and a vision. I built the nonprofit's website myself, working late into the night with coffee in hand and tutorials playing in the background. The logo was a simple open door symbolizing escape autonomy and the courage to walk into the unknown. I didn't sleep much that first month. I poured every spare hour, every favor I could call in into the launch. I applied for small grants, reached out to local women's shelters, and pitched the concept to community boards. I hosted workshops at libraries, churches, and community centers. Most of the time, only a handful of people showed up, but they always came back, and they always brought someone else. And then something amazing happened. People started sharing their stories online through anonymous emails in quiet whispers after events. Grown adults who'd co-signed loans for their siblings and lost their credit. Single mothers forced to hand over child tax credits to manipulative exes. College students whose parents maxed out credit cards in their names while blaming them for the bills. One message stuck with me. I thought I was crazy, that I was selfish. You made me feel sane again. That's when I realized Burden No More wasn't just a mission. It was a movement. I began to receive media requests. First a local Portland radio station, then a spot on a regional news segment titled, "When Family Crosses the Line." I was nervous. I wasn't polished or flashy. But I spoke honestly. About grandma. About the house. About how manipulation is hardest to spot when it's disguised as love. The segment aired on a Friday night. By Monday morning, we had over 800 emails in our inbox. Stories, donations, volunteers, even lawyers offering pro bono help. A family therapist in Seattle reached out wanting to partner on educational webinars. A financial planner from San Diego wanted to sponsor a scholarship program for survivors starting over. Within 3 months, I had to hire 2 part-time staff members to manage outreach and workshop coordination. Within 6, we had an office. By the end of the first year, Burden No More had helped 113 people leave financially abusive relationships, some with emergency housing, others with legal advice, and many simply with knowledge and community. But what humbled me most wasn't the numbers. It was the faces. There was Alice, who brought her 3 kids to every Saturday workshop and cried when she finally said no to her mother's demands for rent money. There was Jordan, a high school teacher who had been supporting his father's gambling debt for 5 years before he realized it was okay to say enough. And there was Lena, only 19, who discovered her stepfather had taken out a loan in her name and walked into our office with a folder of documents and tears in her eyes asking, "Can you help me fight back?" We could, and we did. Still, I had moments of doubt. Nights when I wondered if I was really qualified to do this. If turning my own pain into a platform was selfish or opportunistic, or even just misguided. Dr. Wells reminded me gently during one of our now monthly check-ins, "You didn't build this to fix your past. You built it to protect someone else's future." That's what kept me going. Then, one spring afternoon, as I was leaving the office, I noticed a small envelope slipped under the door. No return address, my name in familiar handwriting. I froze. My hands trembled as I peeled it open. Inside was a folded sheet of paper. "Claire, we heard about what you're doing, and we just can't believe you would air our family's dirty laundry for strangers to gawk at. You humiliated us. You ruined us. But if there's still any part of you that loves us, maybe you'll come to your senses and stop before this goes too far. Your mother." There it was again, the old script. No apology. Just shame, guilt, control. And yet, it didn't hit the same. I didn't crumble. I didn't cry. I smiled. Not with cruelty, but with peace. Because for the first time in my life, their words couldn't reach me. I tucked the letter away unopened any further and walked out into the sun. I had a board meeting to lead. I had a room full of people waiting to learn how to protect themselves. I had a mission. And nothing, not even a mother's shame-drenched letter, was going to stop it. By the time our second anniversary rolled around, Burden No More had grown far beyond what I'd imagined in those early days, hunched over my laptop in a studio apartment. We had a real team now, 6 staff members, a roster of rotating legal and financial experts, a network of shelters and nonprofit partners across 3 states, and a waiting list for our workshops that stretched into next quarter. But I didn't measure our success by metrics anymore. I measured it by moments. Like when a teenage girl raised her hand during a seminar and asked, "So, it's not wrong to want to keep what's mine." Or when a woman in her 60s pulled me aside after an event and whispered, "You gave me permission to finally leave." And then there was the gala. Our first fundraising event was a modest evening hosted in a renovated warehouse-turned-art gallery downtown. The air buzzed with nervous excitement, the kind that only exists when survivors gather not in silence, but in celebration. A string quartet played softly near the wine bar. People walked around looking at photographs on the walls, portraits of women and men who had come through our programs, each paired with a quote they'd chosen to reclaim their power. One read, "I'm not selfish, I'm safe." Another saying, "No saved me." As I stood near the back watching our community come together like threads of the same story finally woven into something strong, someone tapped my shoulder. It was Aunt Judith. She smiled and held up a glass of white wine. Not bad for a girl who was called a burden. I laughed. Not bad at all. We stood in comfortable silence for a moment. Then she added, "Your grandmother would have been here tonight, in the front row, cheering louder than anyone." "I hope so," I said, swallowing the lump in my throat. "She would," Judith replied. "And you know what else I think she'd tell you? It's time to let go of the last piece." I turned to her confused. "What do you mean?" She reached into her purse and pulled out a photo. It was old, creased at the corners, me and my parents, probably around age 8, standing in front of the old fireplace at Grandma's. I was grinning, missing a tooth. My dad had his hand on my shoulder. My mom wore her usual half-smile. I stared at it for a moment, unsure of what to feel. "You don't need to pretend it was always bad," Judith said gently. "There were moments, small ones, but you're allowed to remember them without letting them define you." I nodded slowly. Maybe she was right. I slipped the photo into my clutch and walked to the podium. The room quieted. I looked out over the crowd, not just donors and supporters, but people who had walked through fire and come out standing. I didn't have a speech written. Just a truth I'd been living. 2 years ago, I was called a burden. Not just once, but so many times, in so many ways, by the people who were supposed to love me most. I believed them for a long time. I thought my value was measured in what I could give, in what I could sacrifice, in how small I could make myself for someone else's comfort. I paused. Deep breath. But that's not who I am. And if you're here tonight, it's probably not who you are either. There was a murmur of agreement. "We're not burdens," I continued. "We are builders. We are protectors of peace. We are reclaimers of futures that were nearly stolen." Applause erupted, loud, fierce, healing. As I stepped down from the stage, a thought settled into my chest like a warm weight. I hadn't just changed my life. I had changed the narrative. And maybe, just maybe, that was the most radical thing I could have done. After the gala, I found myself walking home instead of calling a ride. It was late, nearly midnight, and the city had softened. The street lamps cast warm pools of light on the pavement. A few cars drifted by, their headlights blinking across shop windows. It was quiet in the way cities rarely are. I wrapped my shawl tighter and took the long way home. Maybe it was the wine. Maybe it was the adrenaline wearing off. But mostly, I think it was the peace. The kind that creeps in after you've finally stopped running from your story. As I passed a park bench near an old bookstore, I sat down. I reached into my bag and pulled out the photo Aunt Judith had given me, the one of me and my parents so many years ago. I stared at it under the glow of the streetlight. I didn't cry. I didn't feel hate. What I felt was distance. Not the kind born of anger, but of clarity. Those people in the photo were strangers to who I was now, and maybe they always had been. But I didn't need to rewrite history to move forward. I just needed to stop dragging it with me. A part of me had always waited, hoped for something from them. An apology, a moment of realization. A call that said, "We see it now. We were wrong." But it never came. And maybe it never would. What I had instead was something more powerful than their remorse. I had proof. Proof that I didn't need them to become whole. Proof that boundaries could bloom into freedom. Proof that the legacy I was building was more than the sum of what had been taken from me. Back at my apartment, I tucked the photo into a shoebox with other keepsakes I wasn't quite ready to throw away. I wasn't saving them to remember the pain, but to remember that I had survived it. That weekend, I took a trip to the Oregon coast. Just me, a journal, and a weekend's worth of silence. I walked the shoreline barefoot, letting the frigid water lap at my ankles. I wrote pages of reflection, things I'd never said aloud, even in therapy. I listed all the things I once believed I had to be. The peacemaker, the forgiver, the provider, the good daughter. Then I drew a line underneath and wrote what I'd become. The truth teller, the boundary setter, the one who chose peace over performance. I spent the evening wrapped in a blanket on the balcony of my small rental cabin, sipping tea and listening to the wind. No texts, no voicemails, no demands. Just me, alone, and completely free. I thought about Grandma again, as I always did in quiet moments. She had passed down more than a house, more than an inheritance. She had passed down the strength to break the cycle. And I had done it. Not perfectly, not without grief. But I had done it. And now I was ready to live beyond the story of what they did to me. I was ready to write something new. It happened unexpectedly, quiet, almost unnoticeable. But one day I realized I hadn't thought about them in over a week. No dreams, no tension in my chest, no hovering dread every time my phone buzzed. It wasn't that I had forgotten. The memories still lived in me, tucked in places I no longer visited daily. But they weren't calling the shots anymore. I had reclaimed the narrative. And I wasn't just surviving now. I was living. I bought a house. Not a grand inherited Victorian. Not a statement home or a symbol of anyone else's expectations. Just a little 2-bedroom in a quiet Portland neighborhood with a red door and wild sunflowers growing in the backyard. It needed some work, but it was mine, chosen, earned, and free of ghosts. On move-in day, a few close friends came over with pizza, champagne, and folding chairs. We sat on the hardwood floors, drinking out of paper cups and laughing about my complete lack of kitchen organization. Megan, my old college friend who'd stood by me when my parents first imploded, raised a toast. To choosing yourself, she said, holding her plastic cup high. And to making sure no one ever steals that choice again. Everyone clinked cups. I smiled. Later that evening, as the last of the boxes were pushed into corners and the sun dipped low behind the trees, I sat on my back steps listening to the quiet hum of the neighborhood. A neighbor's wind chimes clinked lazily. Somewhere down the street, a sprinkler clicked to life. It was so normal, so blessedly, beautifully normal. No guilt, no demands, just the soft, steady rhythm of a life I had built with intention. Inside, a new photo rested on the mantel, a snapshot from the Burden No More anniversary gala. Me standing with my team, laughter frozen in midair, eyes sparkling with something I hadn't seen in my face for years: freedom. Sometimes I still felt echoes of the past, the hurt, the betrayal, the questions that would likely never be answered. But they no longer ruled me. They were just part of the tapestry, now woven into the edges, not the center. And most importantly, I knew I wasn't alone. Because every workshop, every letter, every person who reached out to share their story was a reminder that this fight wasn't just mine, it was ours. We were the ones who said no more. The ones who broke patterns, set boundaries, and stood up even when our voices shook. We were never the burdens. We were the builders. We always had been. And from here on out, we always would be. It's strange how healing doesn't come with fanfare. No final credits, no sweeping music to signal that the hardest part is over. Sometimes healing is as simple as standing in your kitchen, making tea in a chipped mug, and realizing you're not afraid anymore. That's what my life looks like now. Quiet mornings with coffee and sunlight streaming through new windows. Evenings filled with books. Long walks and phone calls with people who see me not as a source of income, not as an emotional crutch, but as a whole person worthy of love without strings. Burden No More continues to grow, but I no longer let it consume me. I've learned that being of service doesn't mean sacrificing yourself. Boundaries aren't just something I teach now, they're something I live by. And while I'll never get back the version of myself who once believed love should hurt, I'm okay with that. Because what I've gained is so much greater. Peace, clarity, self-trust. Every now and then, I visit the garden center and pick out a new flower to plant in my backyard just like Grandma used to do. It's my quiet way of honoring her, of saying I'm still growing, still blooming. And if someone were to ask me what I've learned through all of this, what I'd tell the version of myself who once stayed silent out of guilt, I'd say this. You are not selfish for setting boundaries. You are not cruel for choosing peace. You are not a burden for being strong. And most of all, you are not alone.